On April 9, 1942, after several months of intense fighting in the Philippines, American and Filipino soldiers were forced to surrender on the Bataan Peninsula to the Imperial Japanese Army. Tired, hungry, and weakened by disease, more than 70,000 prisoners of war were captured by the Japanese. With almost no preparation and no regard for their condition, the prisoners were ordered to march north into Japanese-controlled territory. The journey that followed became one of the most infamous war crimes of World War II. What happened was so brutal and terrifying that it became known as the Bataan Death March. So, as always, viewers are strongly advised because the content of this story is sensitive and heavy. But before we start, if you're new to our channel, please subscribe so you'll always be updated with videos like this. Long before the United States officially joined World War II, the Philippines was already important in the growing tensions in the Pacific. At that time, the Philippines was still under American rule, and because of its location, it was very important to the war strategy. It was at the center of key routes in Southeast Asia, so it served as a stronghold for America in the Western Pacific, and became a way for them to expand their influence in the region. Because America knew how important the defense of the Philippines was, they began to strengthen their military presence here a few months before the war broke out. In July 1941, the U.S. Army formed the United States Army Forces in the Far East, or more commonly known as USAF. It combined American soldiers, those Americans based in the Philippines, and the forces of the Philippine Commonwealth Army. Because of this, an army with around 120,000 soldiers was formed. Most of these soldiers were Filipinos, and many of them were newly called to military service with little experience in warfare. The number of American soldiers was smaller, but they provided most of the leadership and organization for the army. It was expected that the two groups would work together to defend the Philippines in case war broke out in the Pacific. While this was happening, the leaders of Japan were also closely monitoring the situation in the region. For them, the Philippines was both an obstacle and an opportunity. As long as there was still an American military presence here, it was a threat to Japan's plan to expand its control over Southeast Asia. If they conquered the Philippines, that threat would disappear, and they would gain greater control over important shipping routes in the Pacific. By the middle of 1941, it was clear to both sides that if war broke out in the Pacific, the Philippines would surely become one of the first and most important battlegrounds. And just a few months later, that terrifying prediction proved to be true. As 1941 was coming to an end, the fragile peace between America and Japan was quickly collapsing. Tensions between the two countries had been escalating for a long time as Japan continued to expand its influence in Asia. But as the end of the year approached, the situation finally exploded. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes launched the infamous surprise attack on the American military base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. A large part of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was damaged, and America was finally drawn into the war. But although Pearl Harbor is often remembered as the start of the war in the Pacific, it was only one part of a much broader offensive launched by Japan throughout the region. Almost at the same time as the attack on Hawaii, Japanese forces also began attacking various strategic locations in Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. And as expected, the Philippines was one of Japan's main targets. Just a few hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese planes also began bombing American airfields and military installations in the Philippines. Because of this sudden attack, many American planes were destroyed while still on the ground, and USAF forces were severely weakened even before the main assault began. Soon after, Japanese soldiers also began landing in various parts of the Philippines. One of their most important landings took place on December 22, 1941, when the main force of the 14th Army under General Masa Haruhama arrived on the island of Luzon. The combined Filipino and American forces tried to stop the Japanese landing, but by nightfall, the Japanese soldiers had already taken control of key positions and were preparing to advance inland. As the Japanese forces continued to advance southward on the island, Their progress was faster than many military leaders had expected. The situation became even more complicated because the strategy prepared before the war suddenly proved to be no longer suitable for what was actually happening. For many years before this, the American military created a defensive plan called War Plan Orange 3 or WP-03. This plan was based on the possibility that Japan would invade the Philippines. If that happened, the soldiers would not try to defend the entire archipelago. Instead, they would retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and the nearby island of Corregidor. From there, they would block entry to Manila Bay and hold out until reinforcements arrived from America. But when General Douglas MacArthur returned to active military service in 1941 to lead the defense of the Philippines, he believed that plan was too conservative. So instead of immediately preparing to retreat to Bataan, he chose to defend the islands in a broader way by guarding the coastlines. The goal was to immediately block the landing of the Japanese and prevent them from establishing a foothold on land. But eventually, that decision proved to be a big mistake. When the invasion began, it became clear that the situation was changing too quickly for that plan to succeed. The Filipino and American soldiers struggled greatly to slow down Japan's advance. On December 23, just one day after the main Japanese landing, MacArthur was informed that it was no longer possible to maintain the defense on the beaches, and the officials requested permission to retreat. Because of this, MacArthur completely abandoned his coastal defense strategy and returned to the original WPO-3 plan. He immediately issued orders for the American and Filipino soldiers to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, which was considered the strongest position that could be defended. That part of Luzon has long been known as a natural fortress. It is surrounded by water on 3 sides and is connected to the rest of the island by only a narrow strip of land. That's why it was easier to slow down the Japanese advance there. As the retreat began, Manila was declared an open city. This means that the military publicly announced that they would not defend the city. This was done to avoid heavy bombing and to reduce civilian casualties. The government officials were transferred to Corregidor, and the military headquarters were also transferred to Corregidor, while the soldiers in different parts of Luzon continued to retreat to Bataan. Soon, the Bataan Peninsula became the last major line of defense of the combined Filipino and American forces in the Philippines. The battle in Bataan formally began on January 4, 1942. The next battle lasted for more than 3 months. And as time went by, the hardships experienced by the soldiers defending the area only increased. The retreat to Bataan happened so quickly that a lot of supplies and food stockpiles were left behind in different parts of Luzon. Because of this, the soldiers in Bataan quickly ran out of food. Some of them were forced to survive on only half or even 1/4 of their normal ration. At the same time, diseases also spread quickly among the soldiers. Because of overcrowding, lack of medicine, and the harsh tropical environment, diseases like malaria and dysentery quickly spread among the USAF ranks. The medical personnel did everything they could to treat the sick, but they had almost no equipment and were severely lacking in medicine. Despite all those hardships, the Filipino and American soldiers continued to fight against the Japanese invasion. Week after week, they steadfastly defended their lines in Bataan while hoping for help to arrive. But as the months went by, they gradually realized that no help was coming. By early April 1942, the situation in Bataan had completely collapsed. After more than 3 months of intense fighting and desperate conditions, the defenders of the peninsula could no longer continue the war. Thousands of soldiers were sick or nearly dying of hunger, and many of the remaining units could barely fight. Major General Edward P. King, Jr., who led the forces in Bataan, gradually realized that their situation was hopeless. The decision he had to make was extremely difficult. He was ordered by his superiors to continue fighting as long as possible, but he knew that continuing the fight would only result in the senseless deaths of thousands of soldiers who could barely defend themselves. After weighing the entire situation, he met with representatives of the 14th Japanese Army on April 9 1942, and formally surrendered. With that decision, the long battle in Bataan finally ended, and the resistance of the Allied forces in the area was brought to a close. Because of this surrender, more than 78,000 American and Filipino soldiers fell into Japanese custody, a number greater than what the Japanese commanders had expected. The Japanese officials suddenly faced a huge problem on how to transfer such a large number of prisoners away from the battlefield. Because there were only a few vehicles available and almost no proper preparations for the prisoners, their solution would lead to one of the cruelest and most well-known tragedies of the Pacific War. A few hours after the surrender, the U.S. AFA soldiers were gathered in different parts of southern Bataan, especially near the towns of Mariveles and Bagak. Many soldiers then were extremely exhausted and confused. After several months of fighting, the war suddenly ended for them, but they didn't know what would happen next. The Japanese guards began organizing the prisoners and immediately ordered them to surrender any belongings they still had. Their personal belongings were taken, their pockets were emptied, and any valuable items they had were stolen. It goes without saying that this was far from being orderly or humane. In some places, the captives were gathered in wide fields, while Japanese soldiers forcibly searched through their clothes and belongings. It was also noticeable that the guards were interested in anything that used to belong to Japanese soldiers. News quickly spread among the captives that anyone caught carrying Japanese money or souvenirs from Japanese soldiers could be accused of having stolen them from the soldiers who died in battle. And eventually, that fear was proven to be true. In one incident, a small group of captives was separated after being found with items believed to have belonged to Japanese soldiers. Soon after, they were brutally killed by the guards. When this news spread, many captives immediately hid or threw away anything that might arouse suspicion against them. The searches themselves were often violent as well. Some captives were harmed while their belongings were being taken, while others were robbed of their remaining valuable possessions. In one particularly brutal incident, a guard tried to remove a ring from a captive's finger. When he couldn't remove it, he allegedly used a weapon to get it. For the newly captured soldiers, it immediately became clear that surrender did not mean they were safe. Instead, this was just the beginning of a new chapter of intense suffering, a nightmare that would take them on a journey from which many of them would not survive. The next day, the captives were ordered to begin marching north. Their destination was Camp O'Donnell, a former training facility of the Philippine Army located many miles away. The first group of captives began to leave the town of Mariveles on April 10, while others started marching from Bagak the next day. As the journey continued, the different groups of captives gradually came together as they marched north in Bataan toward the town of Pilar, before proceeding to the train station in San Fernando. The captives were divided into groups of 100 people each, and every group was guarded by several Japanese guards, whose duty was to make sure they kept marching. For the men who were forced to walk along the road, the march began under extremely harsh conditions. Many of them had been fighting for several months with little food, and many had already been weakened by illness. Some could barely stand, much less walk the approximately 105 kilometers to Camp O'Donnell. In the early parts of the march, there were a few instances when some Japanese officers showed a bit of kindness. Some prisoners later recounted that there were guards who allowed them to hide some personal belongings or even shared a bit of food and cigarettes. In a strange incident, a prisoner who was once a well-known football player from Notre Dame lost his class ring after it was taken by a guard. But later, a Japanese officer who recognized him because of his college fame returned it to him. But unfortunately, moments like these were rare and short-lived. As the line of prisoners moved farther down the road, the treatment towards them only became harsher. The Japanese guards kept rushing them without any regard for their condition. Anyone who slowed down while walking risked being struck with a rifle butt or hurt with anything the guards could get their hands on. On several occasions, prisoners who stumbled or fell were simply left by the side of the road. Others were finished off with a bayonet or attacked while lying on the ground. One of the cruel punishments described by survivors was what they called the sun treatment. Here, the guards would make the prisoners sit or kneel under the intense heat of the sun for long hours. They were also not allowed to wear helmets or cover their heads, even though many of them were already severely dehydrated. Sometimes this was even done in a place where fresh drinking water was clearly visible and looked so close but was impossible to reach. There were also instances when those who simply asked for water were immediately killed. It seems that the real purpose of this punishment was to weaken and drain the strength of the captives before forcing them to march again. Because of this, water quickly became one of the most important needs of the marching soldiers. From time to time, there were rivers, wells, or pumps along the route, but most of the time they were prevented from approaching them. Some prisoners tried to break away from the line just to drink water, but they were attacked or killed by the guards. Others were forced to drink from the muddy water by the roadside, even though they knew it could carry diseases. Meanwhile, there were Filipino civilians on the side of the road who secretly tried to help by giving food and water to the prisoners. But this was extremely dangerous. If the guards saw a civilian helping a prisoner, they could immediately kill them both. Not everyone died immediately because of the treatment, but the long hours of marching under the intense heat gradually broke down the soldiers' bodies. In some instances, there were trucks following the line that injured prisoners who could no longer move. In other cases, they were finished off by the guards or by the cleanup squad. For the thousands of men forced to march north, the road seemed endless, and with every mile they traveled, the number of prisoners able to continue grew smaller and smaller. After several days of marching in these conditions, the surviving prisoners finally reached the town of San Fernando. For many of them, they might have thought that was the end of their suffering, but in reality, it was just the beginning of a new chapter of nightmare. At the train station in San Fernando, the prisoners were forcibly loaded into freight cars to be taken even further north. These rail cars were old metal boxcars built decades before the war and were never designed to carry so many people. Each boxcar was made for only about 40 people, but more than 100 prisoners were crammed into many of them. Once the doors were closed, the conditions inside quickly became almost unbearable. There was almost no air coming in, and the inside quickly became hot because of the intense tropical heat. Because it was so crowded, there was no space left to sit or even to move your body. The captives were forced to remain standing, pressed against each other as the train slowly moved north. There were also no toilets inside the boxcars, so they had no choice but to relieve themselves right where they stood. As the hours passed, the air inside grew thicker and more suffocating. Some prisoners lost consciousness due to the heat and lack of air, but since there was no space for them to fall, they remained standing, wedged between the other prisoners. After the long train journey, when the doors of the boxcars were finally opened again, many of the men inside were already dead. The survivors of the journey were forcibly made to get off near the town of Capas. But even then, their suffering was not yet over. There was still one last part of the journey they had to take before reaching the place where the Japanese planned to imprison them. Despite the even greater weakness and exhaustion they suffered from the train journey, the survivors were still ordered to continue marching. The last part of their journey required them to walk approximately 9 more miles to reach Camp O'Donnell. But as the prisoners began to arrive at the camp, a new problem immediately emerged. Thousands of tired and sick soldiers were crammed into a place that had almost no adequate facilities to support them. Just like their situation during the battle in Bataan, food was scarce, and the supply of clean water, which they desperately needed, was very limited. There was also almost no proper medical service, even though so many needed it. Diseases continued to spread inside the cramped camp, while dysentery, malaria, and other illnesses kept claiming the lives of the soldiers. The Japanese guards provided almost no medical assistance, so the American and Filipino medical personnel were forced to rely on the few supplies they could find. The doctors and medics did everything they could to treat the wounded and dying prisoners, but they had almost no equipment or medicine available. Because of this, the number of deaths inside Camp O'Donnell quickly increased. For some time, hundreds of prisoners were dying each day. Many of those who died were buried in large pits just outside the barbed wire surrounding the camp. Out of the approximately 78,000 prisoners who started the march a few weeks earlier, it is estimated that only about 54,000 actually made it to the camp. Others were killed right on the road, inside the boxcars during the last part of the journey, or after arriving at O'Donnell. For a long time, the American public knew almost nothing about what really happened on the Bataan Peninsula. Because the forces in the Philippines were defeated, news from there was limited, and many details about the fate of the prisoners only came out later during the war. It was only on January 27, 1944 that the American government officially made public the details of what was called the Bataan Death March. The information came from sworn statements of American officials who escaped from Japanese captivity and returned to the Allied forces camp. In their testimonies, they described the extreme cruelty experienced by the captives during the march and in the camps where they were taken afterward. Soon after, the story spread even more when the testimonies were published in a featured article in Life magazine. For many Americans who read it, the descriptions of destruction, killing, suffering, and severe hunger experienced by the captives were shocking and horrifying. Because of this, public anger against Japan grew even stronger, and the people's support for continuing the war intensified. By the time this news came out, the tide of the war in the Pacific had already begun to turn in favor of the Allied forces. The American forces continued to advance in the Pacific as they gradually pushed the Japanese back toward their own islands. And eventually, the Philippines itself became the site of one of the most important turning points of the war. In October 1944, American forces returned to the Philippines through a massive amphibious assault. From there, the Allied forces continued the campaign to reclaim the entire archipelago. In January 1945, American and Filipino soldiers recaptured the Bataan Peninsula. Soon after, the fighting shifted to Manila, which was finally liberated in early March after a very fierce battle within the city. For many who remembered the suffering of the prisoners from Bataan, this was considered long-awaited justice. After the war in 1945, the Allied authorities began investigating reports of atrocities committed by Japanese forces during the war. The events related to the Bataan Death March quickly became one of the most serious cases. In September of that year, Masaharu Hama, the commander of the 14th Japanese Army during the campaign in the Philippines, was captured by the Allied forces. He was formally charged with multiple counts of war crimes related to the torture and killing of prisoners during and after the march. In February 1946, he was found guilty by the military commission and sentenced to death by firing squad. The execution was carried out in April outside Manila. For a long time, there was almost no official acknowledgement from Japan about what happened. But this changed in September 2010 when a small group of former American prisoners were invited to Japan to receive an official apology for what they had suffered. Although almost 70 years had passed before this happened, that step is considered an important recognition of the suffering endured by the prisoners during the war and in remembrance of those who did not survive the march.